Greetings. Welcome to our study of 1 Peter. I am Johnathan Pritchett. I am excited to be going through the book of 1 Peter with you all. I thank you so much for tuning in to listen. I hope that you get as much out of this study as I get out of studying 1 Peter. Those who know me know that I am a big fan of Peter. I love the Petrine epistles. I love the person Peter. I find him to be very relatable. I think that as sometimes the Apostle Paul is set up on a pedestal above all the other apostles, and because he wrote so many epistles, and a large chunk of the book of Acts is devoted to him. So a lot of people gravitate towards that. I don't. Personally, I enjoy reading the Pauline epistles and studying Pauline theology, but it doesn't get me as excited as Peter, and I don't find Paul as relatable. We get some of Paul's warts, but we get all of Peter's. We just know more about Peter simply from the Gospels and the first part of the book of Acts. And what little bits of autobiography that we get about Paul, which of course the book of Acts is not his biography, and we only get a few glimpses of his biography in his epistles. We see from Peter a man who loves the Lord, who makes mistakes, who dusts himself off, who gets dusted off by Jesus, and goes out there and sticks with it. And so a guy who makes those kind of mistakes that we all know, Peter, opposed by Paul at Antioch. We know that he denied the Lord 3 times. We know that he was always getting things wrong. I don't know. He just seems more relatable to me in that sense. And Paul's quite relatable too once you clear out the evangelical pedestal and overhyping of Paul. Much has been written about Paul. There's so many different perspectives of Paul now. But we want to focus in on Peter because Peter is kind of the underrated apostle. But really, I mean, he had the experience of being with Jesus for 3 years. Paul did not. He had that ordeal where he walked on water. I haven't done that. Paul never did that. So there's a lot of cool things about Peter that you dig into the Gospels and you dig into his preaching and you dig into his epistles and you whatever glimpses we can is a fascinating person. And 1 Peter is a fascinating epistle. I think it's very relevant to our context here in the modern West, something we need to, I think, pay more attention to orient our lives as Christians, following that metaphor of being aliens or so to speak exiles, though we are elect, we are God's people. So it has a lot to say because our situation has some connections to the situation of the people to whom Peter is writing here in diaspora. So let's dig in. This is going to be a little bit long because we are just now starting. So we've got a lot of introductory matters to deal with. I won't belabor it, but I do want to make sure that we include it so that we can get our heads around what we're going to be reading as we go through this study, and things that will help us get in the right frame of mind, categories that we need to keep in mind as we go through the text. And of course, as we go through the text, we'll be reminding of these things. So hopefully down the line where more videos are posted, I hope that people will start at the beginning instead of jumping in at the middle. That they'll start here so that they can get everything that we're going to use as a springboard to jump off into the text. So we're just going to be looking at 2 verses and then using that as our way of setting up the whole book. And then in the next video, we'll probably do a little bit more of that. But this first two verses is the what is called the epistolary prescript. Okay, this is just the basic introduction to epistles. Brief, 2 verses, and I'll be reading from the ESV. I think they get the proper translation of this closer than other English translations. I'm not promising to stick with the ESV throughout this whole verse by verse. It's just the for this section, I thought that they got it right. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles in the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for the sprinkling with his blood, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. So, pretty typical opening, greetings, addressing who he is speaking to. But we do get a lot of theological buzzwords packed into this. You see the word elect there. You see the word foreknowledge there. You see this whole Trinitarian inclusion there with God the Father, the Spirit, Jesus Christ, the reference to sprinkling with his blood, of course, and then terms like grace and peace. Grace, of course, being a word that encapsulates the ethos of this sort of, in the Greco-Roman culture, is patron-client reciprocity. And so, grace, when you see that, the word grace just means benefaction. Or it can mean the beneficence or the graciousness of the one who bestows benefaction, who bestows gifts. It can also refer to, not here, but when you see the word grace, it can be in reference to the gratitude that one shows in response to the gifts or the benefactions that are received. The point of understanding what the benefactions are from any sort of patron, including divine patron like Yahweh, is it's not something that you can secure on your own, no matter what it is. So even in just the socioeconomics of the ancient Mediterranean world, you need land or seed for crops, or you need some sort of investment, or even things like advice, or whatever it is that you cannot obtain on your own. You don't have the means to get it. You seek out a patron who's willing to give, and give generously, and that boosts his honor status among the people for being such a gracious person who gives things to those who could not acquire it on their own. And that's really the key thing about grace. I know a lot of people, and this is a popular definition about it's unmerited favor, and certainly from God, everything that we receive is unmerited. But keeping that in mind, unmerited or merited is not really part of the definition of grace. I know it's a popular definition. It's not really part of it. The key thing is not whether or not it's merited or unmerited. Patrons can give, whether they're divine or human patron. You can give on whatever basis you want. So if God, for example, wants to give grace to the humble and resists the proud, well, there's a sense, if you want to take out all of the leftover baggage from the Reformation and Catholicism debates, and just use merit in the generic sense, there's a sense in which humility can if God wants to give that, and not saying it's meritorious or worthy of salvation or whatever, but if God wants to give certain gifts to his people who are not haughty, not arrogant, not proud, and wants to give it to these humble people, and whether it's just blessings in this life or whatever, that's his prerogative. Patrons can give whatever they want. So while everything that we get from God is unmerited, we want to make sure that we also keep in mind that everything that we receive from God is not only unmerited, but the key thing is It's those things of which we cannot obtain on our own. And that goes for any sort of patronage in the ancient world, whether we're talking about divine patronage or we're talking about just patronage among people in the social classes among the populations of the ancient world. So keep those things in mind. When we see the word grace, we're going to need to understand what it's talking about here. And so Peter, very similar to Paul, is saying, may grace, may the graciousness or the beneficence or even the gifting, the benefactions of Yahweh and the peace with Yahweh, may that be multiplied to you. Which, of course, by the very usage of the word grace, there is a social expectation in the ancient world that when you receive grace, you are to return it with grace or gratitude. And so when the wish is for grace to be multiplied to you, that means you need to multiply your response of gratitude back to the one who has given you the grace. That is built in to this kind of ethos. Whenever you see this grace language, there's a social expectation. As God has freely given, He's unobligated to give, and we certainly don't deserve these gifts as sinners. We are to show Him gratitude and thanksgiving and promote and seek to promote His honor among the populations wherever we are in response. That's our response to the grace, and that's built into the concept. So whenever you see grace to you, you're supposed to give grace or gratitude back for having received it. So that carries that with it. Now, for Peter, it's very interesting how he puts this word elect exiles or chosen aliens together. They're right next to each other. That's why I like this, because in the Greek they're right next to each other as well, these words. The idea is that because of people trained to think in theological categories, they really miss out on some of the sociological categories that go with this. Of course, when we think of elect or election, we're kind of thinking of doctrines, the doctrine of election. And of course, a lot of people will go into, elect is according to the foreknowledge of God. That means God knew beforehand who was going to believe, or some people would say foreknowledge is just a synonym for foreordination. So these people are elect because God foreordained them to become elect. That gets into Calvinism, and Arminians fight over all that. But if you look at what Peter's basically saying, you need to take all of those theological categories and set those to the side. I really don't care what you believe on that. It really doesn't have much to do with these two verses here. Because what Peter is trying to convey is that these people, and of course he's talking to a group, and just for full disclosure, my view of election is primarily corporate. Now that doesn't exclude individuals, it's just primarily as corporate. Individuals belong to the corporate people by identification with the corporate head on the one hand and the corporate body on the other. But clearly, it's talking about a group. And this group located in various places in East Asia Minor. So this idea of exile, we'll get into this a little bit more, but this doctrine for Peter is not a doctrine as such. It is a statement of reassurance, okay? Because what he is trying to point out is that while they are exiles, so to speak, or aliens, or temporary residents, or whatever. Temporary residence is not really quite get it either, as we'll see in a moment. But however your English translation translates this, basically these people, these Jews that are located here, they may have had several generations that lived there. It's just that the people considered them as foreigners, even in their own home even in where they were raised. They could have been there for multiple generations. They just didn't have citizenship. Another thing we'll get into here in a moment. But the idea is this term, it's parapitamos in the Greek. It's kind of a slang term. And Peter bumps that up with the adjective elect. You're elect foreigner or elect displaced person, right? In the scattering, in the dispersion. So the slang term, as we'll look at here shortly, is next to this elect language, this chosen language. And so it's sociologically, it's saying you may be exiles in the eyes of the people, and in a sense, metaphorically, as God's people in the world, where your citizenship doesn't belong here, it belongs elsewhere. But even though that you are that, reckoned that by others, see yourself reckoned as that as well, you are still chosen. And it's according to the foreknowledge of God the Father in sanctification of the Spirit for obedience to Jesus Christ, for the sprinkling of His blood. What is all that about? It is about you are God's chosen people. God knew in advance that His people were going to be in a situation such as this. Okay? It's in according to the foreknowledge of God. It has a purpose in sanctification by the Spirit to be God's people in this situation, in this social setting where you find yourself. God knew in advance it was going to be there, and this is for the obedience to Jesus Christ, to live out that, through the power of the Spirit, for the glory of God the Father, to live out that Jesus people life, that kingdom life, and God knew in advance. This is all, in a sense, a doctrine of reassurance for Peter. This is not a esoteric idea about what does it mean to be elect. Is elect, clearly from this text we're talking about groups of people situated, but how does that work? How does that tie into salvation? How does it, whatever. Get all the theology baggage out of your mind and understand what Peter is trying to point out here. What Peter is mainly aimed at is showing that even though that these people in these locations are displaced, they are viewed by outsiders as unwelcome, as foreigners, as aliens, as strangers, as sojourners, where they are still God's chosen people. And by the way, God knew that He would have chosen people in this situation for a purpose. Election for Peter is not a doctrine to be debated. It is a doctrine to reassure his audience that they have always been in the view of God, to be the people of God in the situation that they find themselves in. And so you can easily take that principle and apply it to your own life. Okay? God knows what He's doing, in a sense. God is sovereign all over all of history. He has a purpose in all of history, and that includes people who are intransient, not really home in their own home, so to speak. So for Peter, and for reading through Peter, because this is kind of a controlling metaphor, we want to keep these things in mind. The more we understand Peter's aims, the more on target our theology would be. How that works for systematic theology, as we go through, we're going to probably take glances at what systematic theologians say about various verses. We don't have time to get into that now, but we do want to take a look at that. But we want to get the theology of the author down first. And so, while you see words like foreknowledge, and you see words like elect, and all of that, they'll jump out at you. We first and foremost want to understand what the author's point is. And it seems to me, and I guess my case will be either vindicated or shown lacking as we go through the study, but it seems to me that election, his use of the word elect, bumped up against that parapitamos language, is really, and this understanding of the foreknowledge of God, this God knowing with and all that entails and purposing it in God's wisdom, and foresight, foreknowledge, whatever, that he has in view this for a reason. So these things are about reassurance more than they are about anything else. I can't emphasize that enough. So just to give you a little bit of historical and social background to 1 Peter, since we're looking at the letter, just taking a look at who it's from and to whom it is for. I like maps. Now, when you look at Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, you see here on the map where it is here in this kind of Asia Minor. Now, we know, and thank goodness this is not a verse-by-verse study of Galatians, so we don't have to unpack the mess that you will find in the introductions to commentaries on the book of Galatians about when it was written and to whom it was written, and then of course you have the issue of overlapping. Where was Peter in relation to Paul? And of course, if you look at Paul's his mode of operation is to not tread on other people's ground. Which, of course, there's plenty of Gentiles out there, and there's plenty of Jews, so there's plenty of room for both. I'm a believer, we'll get into this a little bit later, that Peter also operated in Rome towards the end of his life, and, of course, he was writing from Rome when he wrote 1 Peter. And so, Babylon was code for Rome. There have been other people who have tried to say, well, he was writing from some remote fishing village called Babylon or what. No. People wanted to keep Peter out of Rome, earlier Protestants, because that means, well, that's the Catholic argument that Peter might have been the first pope, which, whatever you make of that, which, me personally, I don't make anything of it, but that's irrelevant. Just because Peter was in Rome doesn't make him the first pope. Anyway, I agree with Scott McKnight, who says if there was any sort of pope in the first century, it was probably James more so than Peter. And of course that goes back to how you understand certain passages in the gospel and on this rock and all that, but not getting into that right now. But there's no problem with Peter being in Rome. It hasn't, the whole, was he the first pope, that's irrelevant. It doesn't really matter. He was certainly there, and this kind of functions as this framing device for the letter, just as they are the audience to whom Peter is addressing. They are temporary, transient aliens, even in their home, even if they've been there generationally. So Peter too, he's elect, chosen. If you look at chapter 5, verse 13. He's kind of in a similar situation, being away from his upbringing home in Galilee. He's there in Rome. He's displaced or out of place, and a home away from home as well. But he too is soon eklektos, together chosen like they are, kind of uniting them. This kind of serves as a framing device for the whole epistle. But Asia Minor just had, just looking at the history of it, Antiochus III, of the Seleucid Empire, which was just these Babylonian provinces after the time of Alexander the Great, around the 3rd century, he ruled from 222 to 187 BC. Now, he sent 2,000 Jews to go colonize this area. That was his saying, go do something with this territory out there. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't natives out there. There already were natives, and this is going to factor into kind of what's going on when we get to what's happening in the 1st century and why the letter looks the way it does. But this area was annexed in 133, and so the road systems was built up to Roman standards at that time, which, of course, as we know in the providence of God, laying the groundwork for the gospel to go out throughout the known world. When the time was full, God sent forth his son, right? As Paul says. So all of this kind of was happening in the centuries prior. Roads were kind of built up to the standards of the Roman expectations so that expansion could take place. Now, when you look at the Western provinces, you got cities like Ephesus and Colossae and Laodicea, big name cities that we know from Paul wrote epistles to Ephesus and Colossae, for example. So that area was more urbanized and more Hellenized. Now, more Hellenized doesn't mean that there was no Hellenism elsewhere in Asia Minor. No, it's just more so. Because it's more cosmopolitan, so to speak. The educated people all over Asia Minor spoke Greek. They embraced that kind of culture. The Jews in the dispersion, life was different for them than it was for the Jews in the land of Israel. And so sometimes they would embrace the culture too. The larger population would participate in the imperial cult as that took shape, and it wouldn't be surprising even if some of the descendants of the Jewish settlers did so as well. Now, the more east you go, it's far less Hellenized, but not completely without Hellenization. That's the whole Mediterranean world was Hellenized to some extent. It's still Hellenized, just less so, if that makes sense. But we don't want to say that they weren't Hellenized at all, or that they were just a bunch of country bumpkins out there. We know that that's far from the case, too. Now, moving along as we get closer to the first century, you've got the Roman general Pompey talked with organizing these provinces, getting them more in line between 74 and 65 BC. And the area of Pontus merges with Bithynia. And of course, this includes a lot of famous cities. You've probably heard of Chalcedon, Nicaea, and Byzantium up there in the northwest corner. Now, very prominent places in church history. But the expansion, as we get closer to the first century, moves north and moves east, especially under Julius Caesar. So the expansion is heading towards where we find Peter operating and sending his letter to the people. Galatia itself becomes a Roman province in 25 BC. And through the Persian, Greek, and Roman, whether the Republic then becoming the empire, the economic and trade in the region continues to increase, which of course whenever you have economic trade and you have commerce increasing, you have affluence and upward mobility increasing, and so that was common in the more urban areas, and that obviously leads to more people wanting to get out that way and get a whole, head west in the United States for the gold rush and all of that. You want to get in on some of that action. Especially in the western side, but there was that happening in the north and to the east as well, the closer we get to the first century. Now, colonization was a big deal. The one thing you don't want, especially in an overcrowded city like Rome, is you don't want a lot of former military type people. You don't want a lot of just overcrowded dregs. You don't want a lot of overcrowded people that either have too much or they have too little clogging up the city. And so the more closer to the central cities, the harder they became to manage. And so colonization throughout the Roman Empire became a pressing matter, especially when you want to maintain your empire. And so you want to fortify your borders, your territory, and keep an eye on others that have been included into the empire, whether they wanted to be or not, so to speak. And so you want to be able to keep an eye the further out you go. So you want a military presence there. You want to Romanize everything, which is distinct from. There was an appreciation of the Greeks and Greek architecture and Greek culture, but Rome and the Roman Empire wanted their own stamp on things as well, and so they want to Romanize things. They want to be able to also accommodate the commerce and trade because that boosts the overall economy of the empire, and of course that gives increased wealth back to the treasury in Rome as well. So all of these reasons are reasons to expand, to keep an eye, a military eye on the frontiers and on your borders. You want to impose, so to speak, your cultural superiority wherever you can throughout the empire. You want to increase trade. So those are reasons for that, and getting rid of people in overcrowding areas is a reason to colonize, and that's why they were really big into that. Now, Claudius is an interesting fellow. Most known to people who read the Bible as the guy who kicked all the Jews out of Rome in 49, which we'll talk about. Now, Claudius, why it's important here, let's talk about that real quick, and then we'll get into this parapetamoist language. Claudius's edict of 49, okay? Now, he dismisses Jews from Rome over disputes about this Christus, which people think was probably Christos, Christ, just misspelled. So in AD 49, you can see that in Acts 18, verse 2, and of course, read Suetonius in Claudius 25.2, Suetonius being a Roman biographer. Now, by the time he died, and Nero's reign started in 54, following Claudius, he reversed many of Claudius's edicts, and you can read about that in where Suetonius writes his biography about Nero. Now, interestingly enough, Nero thought Claudius was a buffoon, and so probably reversed his edicts on the basis that just he did not like Claudius and thought he was an idiot. So just to, stick it to the corpse, I suppose he reversed all that. So both Christians and Jewish Christians will be kicked out, then they can return upon Nero reversing that. We know that Priscilla and Aquila ended up in Corinth, again, Acts 18:2. Then we know that they went to Ephesus with Paul, see Acts 18:18, and then they went back to Rome. Now, why does that matter? Well, as Karen Jobes points out, repeated trips were not uncommon, as documented even among less prosperous Christians. Okay, so these people aren't wealthy, but they could get around, just like Peter could get around. So all this is important to say that Peter probably ended up in Rome at the end of his life, writing from there, hence 513. Now, these repeated trips were not uncommon even among less prosperous Christians. The inscription on the tomb of the craftsman Flavius Zeuxis in Asia Minor records that he sailed 72 times to Rome. That's what this inscription says, in his lifetime, from Asia Minor. And Karen Jobes has a wonderful commentary on 1 Peter, if you're interested. It's in the Baker Exegetical Commentary on the New Testament. So Peter's writing from Rome, and he has that Sune Eclectate connection. He's elect together. It's kind of a compound word of elect, and that Sunergeho language works together. That soon together, electe, the election language. He's in Babylon, which is Rome, and so this kind of frames that letter, as we talked about earlier, with Peter putting himself in a similar situation that his hearers, readers, recipients of his letter find themselves in. So it's really we don't really know what happened to Peter from the biblical data. He just kind of disappears a third of the way through the book of Acts. But we get a sense that he's showing up in Antioch. He's showing up at various places. And so we can go with a little bit of church tradition here and think that it's probably accurate that he ended his life and was martyred in Rome. And that's from where he was writing, and Babylon being a good code for that. Peter, like Paul, was interested in missions and missionary activities and reaching the Jews wherever they were at, and imparting apostolic authority to Jewish believers, even those who were located far away from where he was. So let's look at this parapitamos, is what you find in, that's the word for sometimes temporary residents or exiles or aliens that you find in verse 1. Essentially foreigners. Of course, foreigners were not only those who were deported from Rome, but were also just people who may have been sent to colonize. They were considered foreigners, or they were considered parapitamos, were even if they were just not native. That's kind of the point, that they're not native to that area, even if they've been there for generations. Now, those who were branded parapitamos, which was kind of a slang term again that we talked about, they were sometimes target of persecution and violence. Certainly persecution, social ostracization, to some extent or another. And it could escalate to violence. Citizens are different than non-citizens, even within a city. Now, citizenship is complicated. So you can be a citizen of a city, just like now. I'm a citizen of Evansville, and I'm also a citizen of the United States. But somebody who is here on a visa, they may be a temporary resident of Evansville, but they're not a citizen of the United States, even though Evansville is one of those cities that if you're here legally, you can be afforded certain privileges as well. But it's a little bit more complicated, so I'm just using that as an analogy, because you could be a citizen of the Roman Empire and not a citizen of a city. You could be a citizen of a city and not a citizen of the Roman Empire. And if you were living in that city and you were stationary in that city, it would probably be better and more advantageous to be a citizen of that city, even if you didn't have Roman citizenship. Now, you take a person like Paul. Paul had both Roman citizenship and he was a citizen of the city of Tarsus, right? But cities reserved the right to bestow citizenship to whomever they wished, including Roman citizens, but not always. Citizenship typically had to be bought or had to be earned, or you could acquire it through some sort of benefaction, patron-client reciprocity again, providing some sort of service, money, or any sort of means to acquire citizenship, which would be important if you wanted to be active participant in the city. Now, being a Roman citizen didn't necessarily mean that you had wealth. So if you were deported from Rome or you were sent to colonize from Rome, you come out to these provinces out there, they're not just going to hand you citizenship just because you're a Roman citizen. Because sometimes Roman citizens, that doesn't mean you have wealth. Sometimes they had less wealth. So having Roman citizenship didn't mean that you had wealth. Lacking Roman citizenship didn't mean you lacked wealth either. So sometimes the upper class, wealthier people in these cities who were citizens of these colonized cities, they didn't have Roman citizenship, but it was better to be them than to be a Roman citizen in that city who did not have citizenship and lacked wealth. Now, what if you don't have a lot of wealth, which is most Jewish Christians, and you didn't have Roman citizenship or city citizenship? You might have been recently removed, or you could have even been there in Antiochus's initial colonization and just been there for generations. You're still parapidemos. You're a foreigner. You're an outsider. Now, you compound that. Lacking citizenship means you lack access, okay, to certain things. So you have that issue going on, and you also have the fact that you're not really liked by the non-believing Jews. You're not really liked by the pagans. You're not a citizen, don't have access, so you are having multiple targets on your back. That's the situation that they find themselves in. And notice that it's in the wording, Peter refers to them as eklektois parapidemos. Right? You're chosen aliens. It's that reassurance that despite this social setting, despite what they claim about you, you're also this. You're elect. You're chosen by God. And God had this in view before it came to be. It's according to the foreknowledge of God. He had this and has purposed this. So be obedient, be sanctified, to the sprinkling of the blood, all of that. God the Father is in sovereign control of all of this. So relax, or be reassured, not relax, but be reassured. It's going to be fine. It's going to be okay. Now, when we get into the next portion, we're going to see that suffering becomes a big theme in this, and the Christian response to suffering. How we should view suffering, and it's going to be important. What Peter is aiming at, and I think that what we can take away from it, as believers in our own context, is that God really has had all of this in view, what we're dealing with, what we're going through, and how we need to view even things like suffering, which we'll get into, that we need to understand that God has a purpose in all of this, and we need to focus on living out that purpose, even in the situation that we are. We are, in a sense, strangers, like these Jewish believers. Now, Jewish life and the diaspora is interesting, right? It's not like they were living in some sort of cultural Jewish ghetto. They were thoroughly Hellenized in some respects, whether you're talking about the East or the West in Asia Minor. Now, just to conduct business, they're commonly having to sit down and negotiate and eat meals with pagans just to get through life. Now, that's their situation. So obviously the purification rites would be more frequent among Jews not living in Israel because they come in more contact with pollution, things that defile, according to Torah. But it was just a fact of life. They had to just get through it because that's really their social context. They would say to someone like Peter, how easy it is for you living in Israel to not have to deal with what we deal with, right? How easy it is for you guys to look down your nose at the fact that we incur more pollution. But hey, we have to live like this. And this you see this come to play in the letter too. We're going to be looking at the ideological backgrounds of both the audience and the author, Peter. Okay? Even athletes would hide the fact that they were circumcised so that they could participate in those Olympic-style games. Now, we know Paul is from Tarsus, which is a southern region of Asia Minor, and he was a citizen of both Tarsus. He was also a citizen of the empire, and he was thoroughly Hellenized. Jerusalem was also quite Hellenized in the first century. But even though it was still quite Hellenized and cosmopolitan, even Galilee was. I mean, there was Greek cities in Galilee. So, I mean, it's everywhere by the first century. But even despite that, Jews who lived in the land would probably still find some of the compromises that the Jewish believers made living scattered abroad outside of the land. They would have probably viewed them quite negatively, okay, including Peter. Now, it's fair to say, like I said earlier, that, it's easy for you to say, Peter, you don't have to live here. But Peter is also writing to them, remember our framing device, that he's in a similar situation too. And so, I want to say, given what we know about Peter, this is just a Pritchett thing, but you ever hear pastors who say that when they're preaching their sermons, they're also preaching to themselves? I think Peter's attempts to identify himself with his audience is also an attempt is his way of also reminding himself, though probably he lives a little bit more holier by this point and towards the end of his life than they're living, is still a reminder to himself as well. Now, that's just a Pritchett thing, but I would get that sense that Peter wouldn't object to me saying that, given what we know. This quote from Rodney Stark, Cities of God, written in 2007 on page 78, he says, "Another link between Hellenism and early Christianity was through the Jews of the diaspora, who, like early Christians, also worshipped in Greek. Many of them chafed the ethnic barrier their religion placed between them and full participation in Hellenic society. The law made it difficult for them even to eat with their Gentile associates. When Paul stripped the Jewish prerequisite from Christianity, he not only made the faith open to Gentiles, but offered the Hellenized Jews an attractive religious option, which many of them took." So we can think about this. The gospel, and he's writing about Paul, but it's the gospel in general, and Peter, we know, despite his setbacks, agreed with Paul on what the gospel is. They would find, the people of Paul's audience probably found moving from Judaism to Christianity quite attractive, because they were already having to compromise so much anyway. And when works of the law, so to speak, was no longer the thing that made you the people of God, but rather faith, that would have its benefits. Just some interesting stats about the area. It's about 129,000 square miles in Asia Minor. From east to west, about 1,000 miles, and from north to south, about 350 miles. 4 million people at this time. There were plenty of Roman colonists. There was indigenous populations. You had the Greek settlers, you've got about 300,000 Jews there at the time, and about 5,000 Christians, according to the best estimates. As we mentioned earlier, the more Pauline areas in the west, especially the coast, more Hellenized, less so in the east where Peter was going, but still Hellenized. Now, just like everywhere in the empire, it was very culturally and religiously and linguistically diverse, right? And of course, because it's more eastern, more inland, those churches that Peter is addressing here in 1 Peter are more remote than those that you would find in Paul's missionary journeys. Now, fun facts. The region that we're talking about here and our churches later produced people who attended councils in the 2nd and 4th centuries where very foundational dogmas of the Christian faith were forged. Just some interesting facts. We talk about Aquila and Priscilla. Aquila is from this region. He's from Pontus. After the 1st century, The heretic Marcion is from Sinope. The Aquila, who made a more literal translation of the Old Testament into Greek, aside from the Septuagint, was also from there. Remember, the Septuagint was written by Neoplatonists in Alexandria about 200 years prior to the first century. But a different Aquila made his own translation, more literal one. Epictetus, who was a slave and a Stoic philosopher, is from Hierapolis, which was the Roman Galatia, as was Papias, who was frequently quoted by Eusebius. Now, Basil, the bishop of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus, they were all from Cappadocia, one of those provinces listed in 1 Peter 1:1. And of course, they were all defenders of the Nicene Creed against Arius. So, amen. So, Peter's influence, I think, in this region had some pretty strong legs to it. At least I think so. Now let's look at some epistolary considerations of 1 Peter. Authorship and date. 64-ish. There's always an ish, right? We don't know for sure, but 64-ish is where I'm going to put this around. Who wrote it? Well, it says Peter. So, Peter wrote it. As people who believe that the Bible actually is true, Peter wrote Peter, 1 Peter. And I get into 2 Peter down the line, and of course I believe Peter wrote 2 Peter as well. Of course, it's filled with allusions to Jesus' teachings here. Why do I think Peter wrote it? Well, Silvanus wouldn't carry a false letter if Peter was long dead. And of course, Mark never pretended to write his gospel in Peter's name, so this would have been Peter. Now, first century acknowledgement from Clement and universal church acknowledgement that Peter was the author. What about it being synonymous, as some people claim? Well, what do they say? Well, their argument is the Greek is too good for it to have been Peter, which this is rubbish. And we'll, aside from just using an amanuensis, we need to dispel the Peter was always remained uneducated, backwater, ignorant country bumpkin, which is nonsense. They say the content reflects a church structure and social situation later than Peter's lifetime, which again is wrong. And we'll look at why. Now, this other one, dependence upon Deutero-Pauline works, and thus comes after the Deutero-Pauline works. And if Paul didn't write books like Ephesians, and we'll look at similarities of that, then Peter could not have written 1 Peter. And of course, being the earlier dater and rejecting this Deutero-Pauline stuff, because I believe Paul wrote all 13 letters ascribed to him, and those arguments fall flat that he didn't. This isn't much of an argument either. And the idea that Christianity could not have been so active in remote Asia Minor, except that it could have, right? And we'll look at some of these reasons why. But when we're talking about pseudepigraphy, what do we mean? Well, there's not to be confused with the pseudepigrapha of, Second Temple literature writing under a false scribe like Enoch. We know Enoch didn't write Enoch, and nobody believed when those books were being composed that Enoch actually wrote it. They at best would be recollections of traditions ascribed to him, but nobody believed that Enoch actually penned that, right? That person was long dead. But pseudepigraphy is just someone who wrote a document in the name of someone else, generally speaking, usually to gain greater authority for the contents of the document. Now, previous scholars have supposed that this was acceptable for a disciple of a prominent person to write in that person's name in the first century. Now, conservative scholars and liberal scholars have both rejected this, that this was acceptable. In fact, I think Lutheran scholars are the only ones clinging to this idea. No offense to Lutherans. Just no one else believes this. most confessional scholars and liberals like Bart Ehrman say, no, this is not acceptable. Now, again, not to confuse it with Jewish pseudepigrapha with all of that false ascriptions to Jewish figures that were long dead. That nobody had a problem with that. But the idea that you're trying to pass yourself off as Paul or Peter being acceptable practice, no, it was not. This was unacceptable and dishonest practice in the ancient Near East. And I think that case has been made, except for Lutherans. Some Lutheran scholars who think, Paul didn't write Ephesians, but it's okay because one of his disciples did, and that was fine in the first. No, it wasn't. There's no evidence that it was fine. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that it wasn't fine. I like what Ben Witherington says here. He says, it would be very difficult to successfully pull off a pseudepigraphical letter in early Christianity, which had a concern about intellectual property and pseudepigraphical documents in the first century. They were worried about this, right? No literary convention in that era allowed one to think that pseudepigraphical letters were an acceptable literary device. Here are some arguments against pseudepigraphy that Peter didn't write Peter. What it would require, first and foremost, would not just the audience, not just the author being anonymous, but also the audience. If you state who your audience is, you're more likely to get busted because they're like, hey, we didn't get this letter. We're not dealing with these issues that we're supposedly dealing with, right? Now, the practice was unacceptable. There was a bishop who tried to write a 3rd Corinthians, and when he was caught in Paul's name, he was tossed out. Only certain literary genres in the Second Temple tradition allow for pseudepigrapha, and that was only long after the supposed author, the false ascription, was dead, like Enoch or Moses or whatever. Now, 1 Peter is none of those things, because Peter wouldn't have been long dead. And that trying to pass yourself off as Peter would have been seen as unacceptable. As far as his Greek, Peter could have had a amanuensis, but even with that, Peter would have known Greek and could have picked up better Greek while he was in Jerusalem, and in his travels, and in his discussions with Hellenistic Jews. Right? As a businessman, as a fisherman, most of the world, past and present, was bilingual or even trilingual. And it would make sense that fishermen, well-to-do fishermen, would have to conduct business. Galilee was Hellenized. Greek cities, he's probably trying to do commerce. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. So even with the help of amanuensis, or even without it, it's perfectly reasonable to think that Peter was decent enough to communicate his ideas. And later on, as he got older and got more experience in his travels and spent more time in Jerusalem, where it was not uncommon to hear Greek, inscriptions all over Jerusalem from the first century were written both in Greek and in Hebrew, in Aramaic. The idea, what is great Greek? The Greek is too good for what is great Greek? Well, that's subjective. And the letter indicates that there was Aramaic interference. So in the grammar and syntax. So somebody trying to use Greek, trying to use the way you would speak if you were a native Aramaic speaker, is present all throughout the text. Now, the persecution that is mentioned here is not as severe, the sufferings, the persecution that they're facing, as during the reigns of Domitian, which would have been later, around 81 or 96, or even Trajan around 98, all the way into 117 AD, right? Now, Pliny was writing between 109 to 111 AD to him, and he reported of persecutions and mass recants happening 20 years prior to that, which you take that back to the 90s. 1 Peter doesn't give us that much of an escalated persecution. So that's too late. Now, church tradition, if we're looking at arguments for why I'm putting this around 64-ish AD, church tradition universally has Peter in Rome at the time of his death, around 66, maybe 67, 66-ish, right? And the coded language Babylon is almost universally considered as Rome, which is what it was in Second Temple literature. It's what it was in the book of Revelation. He's writing from Rome. It's virtually silent that he was much of anywhere else. In Acts, go look up Acts 12:17 for reference. Except that we know he was in Jerusalem. We know that he was in Antioch. He probably passed through Corinth. If you take that reference, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. He certainly may have had fans there for Paul to rhetorically use his name. As we discussed earlier, quoting from Karen Jobes about the craftsman who was from Asia Minor traveling 72 times to Rome, Peter could have easily traveled to and from Rome and back from Jerusalem and wherever else he was at. After he was released in Jerusalem, between the time of that and his martyrdom, he could have been all over the place. Not that difficult. The earlier Protestant concerns about we don't want him in Rome because that might make him Pope and substantiate the claims of Catholics is irrelevant. That's not an argument one way or the other. Whatever you make of that, which I don't make anything of it, of Peter being the first Pope, but whatever you make of it is irrelevant to whether or not he was there. That's a different argument, whether he was bishop or the first Pope. It doesn't really matter. The issue is, was he in Rome or not? And the best evidence was that he was, and whatever other claims are made on top of that, that him being in Rome doesn't make him a pope. Now, Paul and Peter could have overlapped in many places, including places like Rome, but they didn't necessarily overlap in the same communities. I mean, Rome's big. There's a diverse population. Yes, Peter may have ran into some Gentiles. A lot of people thought that First Peter was written to Gentiles, except for the early church, and then Wesley and Calvin and others. And many modern scholars now, conservative scholars, are leaning more back towards him having a Jewish audience. But that doesn't mean there were no Gentiles that were among the communities. And just like Paul was writing primarily to Gentiles in Rome, doesn't mean there was no Jews. It's not a hard and fast thing. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles and still went to the synagogues first. Right? No big deal. But the persecution that we find in 1 Peter fits Nero's earlier reign. It just makes a lot of sense at that time. Now, why do we not think primarily Gentiles? Well, you have Pentecost, where you have people gathering to Jerusalem and then going back out to where they're from. A lot of these provinces mentioned there in Acts 2. Colonization, deportation of Jews from Rome. Where are they going to go? Basic situational evangelism, Peter's evangelistic efforts. These are going to all account for why there was Jewish Christians and Christians in general in these remote areas of Asia Minor. Now, in chapter 1, verse 14, ignorance is a polemic used against Jews elsewhere in the New Testament. See Acts 3:17 and Acts 13, verse 27. And that Peter's ethic, his moral holiness codes, is much stronger than the Hellenistic Jews would be. And his echoing there of Leviticus chapter 11 would resonate with those primarily Jewish Christians. Okay? Well, what about the statement, empty ways inherited from the fathers? In chapter 1, verse 18. Well, that could be a reference to the wilderness generation. Or it could be a reference to the exile generation. And we know that this peripetemois and this parokois language that you find, parokois meaning stranger and peripetemois meaning the alien or exile or foreigner language. foreigners and strangers, aliens and strangers, exiles and strangers, however you want to use it, you find in verse 1 and then chapter 2, verse 11, that language kind of controls the theological and sociocultural dynamics of the letter, right? And given this kind of language, being the controlling metaphors, where the literal situation of the people being addressed here, and even Peter's own situation in Rome, that allows him to give rise to this as not just a sociocultural, but more of a this metaphorical sense in which all Christians are this way, wherever they are. And I think Peter some people would say, like, if you want to use the language, spiritual metaphor or spiritual situation. If you want to I don't really care for that language, but that's kind of what I think maybe people mean by that. The application of that to all Christians in a metaphorical sense of being our citizenship is elsewhere, it's in heaven. So we are sojourners, we are strangers, we are aliens here in our own homes, right? The socio-cultural situation gives rise to its metaphorical usage that we could apply beyond this letter to even us today. So this empty ways inherited from the fathers would be a reference to either the wilderness or the exile generation, maybe both. You want the exile generation to be there as probably the more prominent allusion. Now, when he echoes Hosea in chapter 2, verse 10, Israel, in the original context, was the target of Hosea's criticism. So that's another piece there why he's probably talking to Jewish believers. And of course, chapter 4, sorry, my light goes off periodically. In chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, Peter doesn't call his audience Gentiles or nations. And of course, Gentiles don't call, hey, we're the nations, or hey, we're Gentile. They don't call themselves that, right? But see, as we talked about Peter being from the land of Israel, he's a more conservative Jew than Jewish Christians would be. So he's speaking of this Gentile behavior in that way, kind of in a sense of shame, rebuke kind of sense, admonishing them not to return to this Gentile-like behavior. They need to be set apart, right? They need to be holy. So that kind of takes it away from this idea of primarily Gentile audience back to seeing the audience as majority Jew. So what is the occasion of the letter? Well, from what we can glean from the text, implies that there's doubts and confusion in these churches about God's work and presence in their lives. Hence, the way he starts this letter. You are chosen people. And this was according to the foreknowledge of God. He's in control. There's, hopefully that, and that, then it goes on and suffering becomes a big point of the book. So, you can get a sense that he's trying to buffer them from departing the faith and returning to the old ways. Peter sees a need to strengthen and teach the churches of the true grace from God through Jesus Christ and his life, death, and resurrection. That's always at all times and all places, a healthy teaching for us to be mindful of the true grace of God, what God has done through Jesus Christ, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the overflow of gifting and grace upon grace that he continues to bestow upon his people. It's to teach us how to live as citizens of God's kingdom, being a part of God's family, while being strangers, aliens, in the meanwhile, right? And again, the metaphorical sense that Peter draws out from the literal sociocultural sense applies to us as well. It is to encourage and command, in a sense. There's imperatives and indicatives given in these ambiguous verbal forms. It is to command certain courses of action, certain courses of behavior, in resistance to the societal pressures, the persecutions, the scorn, the ridicule, the shame from those beyond the Christian community. Right? This is the course of action you need to take. This is how you need to be the people of God in the situation that God has placed you in and knew that you would be in the situation, and it has a purpose. So I like this, what Joel Green says. He says, together with the book of Revelation, 1 Peter is unrivaled among New Testament documents for its concern with questions of Christian identity, constitution, and behavior in a hostile world. The world is against us as believers. Different parts of the world face different levels of persecution. I think the level of persecution that we are facing is approaching the levels of 1 Peter, which again is not near as severe as it would be in later decades for believers in the time that Peter wrote this. Certainly in parts of the world, we have Christians being persecuted far more and with more violence than some of us face here in the West. But no matter how much societal pressures and persecutions and shame and scorn and ridicule, a world hostile to the Christian faith, 1 Peter resonates because it tells us how to be the people of God in those kinds of circumstances. Who we are in Christ, and how God has purposed us to be where we are, even in situations that seem that it looks like, the where is God in all of this suffering? How are we to view this suffering? How are we to handle this persecution? What is the purpose in it? And of course, the ultimate purpose in everything is to reflect the glory of God. And to bring glory to God. And how we respond to these pressures, being the people of God, brings Him glory, and is a testimony to the powerful, transforming grace of the gospel. So now more than ever, I get excited about a book like this because we need to draw deeply from its well. So I thank you for joining me with this. A little over an hour spent on 2 verses, but we're trying to set things up. In the next section, we'll take a little bit larger of a chunk. So I hope that you stick with the study, and may God richly continue to bless you, and God bestow His peace upon you.